Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 5, Episode 44. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The NBA is involved again in a gambling scandal. This week, we'll talk about the open secret that's well known in the NBA. The NBA for years has had a gambling problem. Is the NBA trying to address it, or is the NBA trying to normalize gambling in modern society? Thank you to all of my longtime listeners. I do appreciate you. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Please consider supporting.
Act 1, the NBA has always had a gambling problem.
When sports betting was legalized and it married itself to these leagues, these professional leagues, it was only a matter of time before we had a sports betting scandal involving players. I didn't imagine coaches, but I did imagine players. And no league is more vulnerable to this than the NBA, the National Basketball Association. The NBA has a long history of gambling, both players gambling just to gamble. They love gambling. They want that high that they can get from high stakes winning and losing, just like they had when they were on the floor. And while you could say that about any professional sport, that a lot of these athletes during and after their careers are still chasing that high, and gambling's one way to do it, the NBA is unique in the other way gambling has influenced it, because there are only 5 players on the floor for any given team. One player can have a significant, a direct influence on the outcome of a game, and therefore they are the easiest targets for gamblers to rig games, to fix games. Hey, I want to fix a National Football League football game. You'd have to have in the bag one of the quarterbacks, very likely the head referee. Maybe that alone could do it, but then very likely one of the members of the coaching staff of one of the teams. There's too many players on the field, and there are too many variables at play. There have been scandals in professional soccer, international football, but usually those scandals with respect to betting and fixing games, they involve the referees. And they involve the head referee. It's not as hard to fix the outcome of a game if you can get to one guy who's refereeing the entire field. That's unique to soccer. Although people like to throw temper tantrums about it, Pete Rose bet on baseball, and yet the only thing they could ever prove was that Pete Rose bet on the team that he was playing on, or the team that he was managing, to win, to succeed. Pete Rose was betting on himself. The only other real scandal about fixing games in baseball was the 1919 White Sox. Now, I hope there's somebody out there who can immediately recall, or maybe even just Google, whether or not there's been another fixing games scandal in baseball. But the one in baseball involved multiple players, including pitchers. Not pitcher singular, pitchers plural. Have you ever heard of there being a fixing scandal in hockey? Hockey players trying to throw the game? Then there's basketball. We could talk about college, but let's focus on the NBA. This isn't the first time the NBA has had a scandal with regard to gambling. The NBA, out of all of the leagues, is the easiest to influence if you are an individual player. You can take yourself out of the game claiming an injury. You can take yourself out of the game on the floor. You just have a terrible game. You can influence so many different variables while you're on the floor. You can influence so many variables if you have to take yourself out of the game. I don't think I've said anything revolutionary so far in this podcast episode. Here it is, though, the reason why I wanted to do this segment. I've always believed that the NBA has known that it had 2 major problems, and as much as the league could, it was going to try to keep these 2 issues out of the limelight, because it knew, it has known collectively over the course of years, the course of different NBA presidents, NBA league executives, that we can't change this. This is part of the culture of this league, and we can't change it. 1, drugs. 2, gambling. Let's all reflect on the fact that the NBA actually changed its drug policy specifically to not test for marijuana because it knew, David Stern knew, Adam Silver knows, that if they ever tested for marijuana, 90% of their players would test positive. Rather than take a hard line against it, the league changed its policy. If you want to talk about how the NBA has courted gambling in the past, one of my favorite stories about the NBA is David Stern suspending several key players of the Phoenix Suns against the San Antonio Spurs, 17, 18 years ago, because there was a kerfluffle. That's what I will call it, a kerfluffle on the floor, and players from the bench on the Phoenix Suns got involved. Well, there's a hard and fast rule in the National Basketball Association, and David Stern is a law and order type commissioner. And that rule stated if you came off the bench to get into a fight, you were immediately suspended. And that's exactly what he did. One of the people that frequents this podcast, in fact, this gentleman frequented the podcast last week to do a movie review with me. His name is Jason. He defended David Stern suspending several members of the Phoenix Suns, stating by the letter of the law what they did was wrong, and Stern had no choice but to suspend them. At the same time, there was a man named Tim Donaghy who was a referee in the league, and guess what? He liked to gamble, and guess what? He got sideways with some of the wrong people that are involved in gambling, which I'm going to get to. And he was leveraged into giving information to these people to place bets on games that he was refereeing. Now, he still claims to this day that he really never rigged any of the games. In other words, he never influenced the game by way of his calls. He just knew the league so well, and he knew what information was going to influence the outcome of certain games with certain teams and certain players, that he willingly gave that information to nefarious characters in the gambling underworld so as to satisfy whatever debts he or people close to him had with nefarious gamblers. In investigating internally this betrayal by a referee, David Stern found out that most every other referee that he had in the league gambled in some fashion, whether it was gambling on other sports, gambling as recreationally as participating in an NCAA elimination bracket for the men's Final Four. Every single one of his referees were gambling in some fashion. Well, you guessed it, dear listener. There was a hard and fast rule. It was black and white. If you were a referee and you gambled, you were subject to termination. There was no second chance. There was no write-up. If you were caught gambling and you were an NBA referee, you were going to get fired. And guess what David Stern did? He changed the rule. The man didn't bat an eye. He changed the rule, and if you watch the documentary on Netflix about Tim Donaghy, there is a great case to be made that the NBA used its influence in a number of the halls of power to get the FBI to wrap that case up against Tim Donaghy as quickly as possible. Adam Silver wrote an op-ed in the New York Times courting gambling in professional sports, advocating that the marriage between these books, these sports books now that are all online, and professional sports was a good thing. I can remember reading that and thinking, this is akin to Adam Silver coming out and advocating, look, marijuana has medicinal properties that help athletes in ways that we never appreciated in the past, and we need to be more progressive and embrace the fact that this is a substance that's being used by athletes to medicate, to help rehabilitate, and it shouldn't be shunned, it should be welcomed. No difference whatsoever. He knew that his league had a problem with drugs. He knew his league had a problem with gambling. Why not invite it? Why not make it more socially acceptable? Why not have a different lens in the public culture surrounding this versus trying to stay in the 1970s and the 1960s and resist it? Adam Silver was doing what he thought was best for the league. Is there evidence that the league was actually aware of its gambling problem and tried to change the public image of gambling with respect to its marriage to these leagues? That not only could there be a coexistence, but that somehow having these leagues be integral in the way these sports books operated would in fact make for cleaner gambling. It's the argument for legalization of drugs all over the country. Look, if we legalize drugs, we can regulate drugs. We don't want to put it into the back alleys. We want to keep it out in the light, and we can therefore regulate it and understand its implications on society. Once understood, we can then influence those implications. This is just some healthy billion-dollar corporate cope that the federal government has identified and outed several gambling scandals over the course of the last 3 to 4 years, which it turns out that the NBA had internal investigations about and didn't find any wrongdoing. Now you have to think to yourself, what kind of internal investigations is the NBA conducting that these things were on their radar? They knew well enough they had to get in front of it by at least investigating it. They couldn't find any smoking gun well enough that they were going to penalize a player, penalize a team. The feds, months, if not years later, turn around and make them look like fools. I've talked about this on the podcast before, this whole paradigm about turning these players into drug addicts because we're not going to have any progressive therapies for them during the course of a season or even after a season in an off season so they can get well enough to play in the next season. What we'll do is we'll pump them full of opiates and then we will turn them into functional drug addicts and then chew them up and spit them out after their career is over. It's a conscious, if not subconscious, awareness that what we're doing is probably wrong, that we are creating this addiction in these players, but it's still palatable for the public. They don't seem to mind, and all we care about is the dollars anyway. So until there's a change in the public consciousness, this is the way we're going to do it. It's the same thing for gambling. Gambling is an addiction. There are players like Charles Barkley. I heard him have this debate with Kenny Smith when this news broke about Terry Rozier, and Kenny Smith was basically saying, look, a guy who is willing to risk his contract with the Miami Heat for millions and millions of dollars, the reward for that risk being potentially a couple $100,000, that is not somebody who is looking at things rationally. This is the mind of an addict. And because Barkley loves to gamble and doesn't feel like he has an addiction, he's basically saying, no, Rozier's just stupid. Barkley's wrong here. Gambling is an addiction. I got into a little bit of a debate with Jason last week during our movie review of One Battle After Another, calling one of the characters, the male protagonist, a drug addict, and he was like, well, he just drinks too much and he smokes marijuana every single moment of every single day. Well, the fact of the matter is, you may not be using a needle between your toes because you've worn them out in every vein of your body, but you're still an addict. And a gambling addict is an addict. They demonstrate the same behavior as any other addict. If at the end of the day, you make completely irrational decisions, you'll steal money from anyone that you can, and no matter the consequences, no matter how many lives are destroyed, you're going to do it again. You're an addict. The fact of the matter is, dear listener, there are a lot of gambling addicts in the National Basketball Association. They demonstrate it every single day. Michael Jordan famously ran up millions of dollars of debt to people in the underworld, gamblers, And it fueled this conspiracy theory that the reason why he left basketball in the mid-90s was because Stern realized what a public relations problem it was, and he asked him to step away so that that whole situation could die down in the media. He pays off all his debts, he could come back. I don't believe it at all. I don't believe that that's what happened. I believe that Michael Jordan did want to leave basketball because of the public pressure. Go watch the Bulls, that ESPN, I believe it was a 10-part series on the Chicago Bulls. But if you put yourself in the position where you are with these nefarious gangsters or these gambling underworld characters and you're gambling with them and you end up owing them hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not maybe millions of dollars, you're going to fuel speculation that those people now have influence over you in your professional capacity. That is, basketball player on basketball court. Whether someone had leverage over the Terry Roziers of the world, what was the other guy's? Jonte something, the Toronto Raptors player. He's a point guard. He is a guy who comes off the bench. He wasn't someone who had made hundreds of millions of dollars in his basketball career. He got sideways based on gambling debts, and he had to do things in order to make up for those debts, namely, to the extent that he could, influence the outcome of basketball games. There are a number of studies that are coming out about how bad the gambling addiction is in this country based on the legalization of gambling through online portals, these online sports books. I am not against gambling. I'm not against anybody participating in any of these online sports books, making a bet with a friend, participating in an NCAA elimination tournament bracket. As I've said before on the podcast, rarely does banning something actually work. But the reason why you see all these ads for these sports books and you see these relationships now between these leagues, which are basically corporations, and these sports books, which are basically corporations, is because there is a shit ton of money flowing into these sports books, and there's no other way that could be possible than people are losing. They can't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on corporate ads if they're paying out to everyone who's gambling. The house always wins, and there is a lot of money being lost. And I bet if you go and you look at the numbers, and I've seen some statistics that bear this out, it's probably between 15 and 20% of all of the players that are in this pool of online gambling through these online sports books. They're losing probably 75 to 80% of all the money that's being made by these sports books. That's the population at large. But when you hear all of these stories in the NBA about how players spend their time together when they're traveling during the season, how they spend their time in the off season, so much of it is surrounded by gambling. They are playing cards for money on the airplane going from city A to city B. They're playing golf with one another, and they're betting on every hole. Hell, they're betting on strokes. They are going to casinos, and now, as it turns out, they are going to these unlicensed private poker games. Where is this all leading? No one in this country, in the year of our Lord, 1950, would have ever thought that boxing would become a laughingstock in the public eye. No one would have ever thought that horse racing would fall out of the public favor. Yes, those sports don't translate as well to the television as National Basketball Association basketball, National Football League football. But one of the issues with those sports that a lot of people now are wrestling with is the fact that we never trusted the outcome of boxing matches. Too many nefarious influences, too many stories of fixing matches, whether or not that was the fighters or even the referee. You don't think that of horse racing? How many scandals have there been in horse racing where you find out that some of the top horses, some of the top jockeys, some of the top trainers are basically juicing these horses? If we incrementally yet progressively start to believe that the outcome of these contests are fixed, the public is going to stop paying attention. And it's not the diehards that the NBA wants. This is like a political party. The people who are already going to vote for a Republican are going to vote for a Republican. The people who are already going to vote for the Democrat are going to vote for the Democrat. What you want is the people on the margins, the people who are undecided, the people who you may be able to influence. I don't know if any of you ever watched Pablo Torre Finds Out. He's an excellent sports journalist, and I mean that when I say it. I don't mean that he's a sports reporter that takes whatever is fed to him by an individual team or an individual player or particularly a league and just regurgitate it so that he can keep access. He's an actual journalist. And if some of the things that he's hearing are to be believed that he's published in recent podcasts, this is the tip of the iceberg. There is much more to this story about gambling in the NBA than has already been reported. And as we've seen, there's been a shitload reported. Some of you may be too young for this, but when cocaine hit the news in Major League sports, particularly the NBA and Major League Baseball in the mid to late 80s, it landed like a nuclear bomb. But it didn't happen all at once. It was one player getting caught here, one incident being reported there, and before you knew it, this widespread thing that was an open secret within the league became public knowledge. The NBA has kept its gambling problem a secret as it has ascended into the stratosphere of corporate dollars, of corporate partnerships. This is Lance Armstrong, neck deep in his relationship with Nike, being exposed as a drug fraud, as someone who'd been juicing in order to accomplish his amazing results, and watching Nike completely walk away from him. I try not to do the speculation thing because the future is so uncertain. I don't think any of these sports books are going to walk away from the NBA or any other sports league for that matter. But what about all the other corporate sponsors? What happens when more and more of us start to realize that the same type of addict that would spend all of his money on an OnlyFans girl is doing the same exact thing on a different type of app? He just happens to be blowing all of his money on different prop bets on NBA games. And what happens when the kind of characters out there who've always been involved with gambling in the underworld realize how much opportunity that creates for them? Does American Express want to be married to that? This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.